Good evening. Welcome to DiversiTV. If you are seeing this for the first time, welcome. If you are part of our growing legion of viewers, welcome back. DiversiTV is broadcast every week during academic terms at Lane Community College. It's not a class yet, but eventually it will be. And tonight, our episode is Two-Way Seeing, which combines native and pioneer perspectives. Our seasons, we're in season 7, and our seasons roughly correspond to LCC terms. So we've been doing this for going on almost 4 years, have about close to 80 episodes. And our mission, should we decide to accept it, not impossible, is to illuminate everyday diversity issues and give the mic and the camera to those who don't always get it. To that end, our schedule roughly follows the following design, though we improvise quite a bit according to guest availability and spontaneity. Because we're on Turtle Island, we always start with a native perspective, as we do every season. And then because we speak English, we also go with an Anglo perspective, usually Anglo or European American or whatever people want to be politically correctly called. We often discuss that different perspective. This year we did an Asian American perspective, the third week, a Latino perspective, African American perspective last week. This week is Two-Way Seeing. We'll have a youth perspective class, spirituality and religion, which in the past has combined usually native spirituality, but also other spiritual perspectives outside of the Abrahamic traditions, which is basically Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And we'll basically be looking at what we'll have after that. Gampia Lahwa, which is Komema Kalapuya Hello, since we're on Kalapuya ground here. And I often, if you've tuned in, you've heard me use a variation of that, and I had my pronunciation corrected by my Kalapuya language teacher, one of our guests. So, Two-Way Seeing. If you've seen the Oregon Chautauqua presentations of our guests tonight, then you know what we're talking about. But if you go to slides again. So, for example, this two-way seeing issue, generally speaking, since I teach ethnic studies, so on other LCC classes and on campus, and you'll hear these rubrics being thrown around, the whole Columbus discovered America, Christianity and slavery civilized brown people. Like, you know, there is one of my colleagues in the history department that has actually made this statement that slavery improved black people by civilizing them. Yeah, okay. And you people came over on the land bridge. I'm a Native American because I was born here, and this is from a person normally considered Anglo. So, you know, you get that. Okay, so, all right. And so, you know, down south, you know, there's a poster that I've seen around. I've actually had on my wall, but not in my office. Who are you calling illegal immigrant? Pilgrim? And so I've expressed the view myself, you know, it's not your homeland unless you've been on the land for at least 100 generations. That is, following the human perspective that the people are the land and the land is the people, and you live on a piece of land long enough, and it gives you your language. And so in England, they speak English. Italy, they speak Italian. France, French. Okay? Hawaiian, Hawaii. So this convention, the idea of people connected with place, is an ancient one. So, you know, if you've seen the T-shirts, Homeland with Geronimo and his relatives, you know, kneeling, Homeland Security, fighting terrorism since 1492. And so some could say, okay, well, that's when we first started. So that's where that perspective comes from. So when there is a dialogue about what we in academia call indigeneity, like who has a sense of place and where do you get that sense of place and what does that sense of place mean? And what at the U of O was at a conference on racial formation, I heard an interesting term called settler colonialism, that America is based on settler colonialism. So it's often acrimonious with a lot of finger pointing. So our guests tonight have made an art form of a dialogue between indigenous people and the relative newcomers, those who have been here for less than 100 generations, in this experiment we call America. So our guests tonight, Esther Stutzman and Shannon Applegate. Welcome.
Good to be here. Thank you for having us.
So, how did you come to do this two-way seeing thing? Why don't you give us a bit about how that dialogue goes?
Well, it started out really rather by accident, in just conversations we had based on the friendship of our family. And our family friendship goes back over 150 years. And because we're both educators, we thought, wouldn't this be a good thing to bring to the schools, to kids, to make them understand that it's not always cowboys and Indians? And we just started from there and put together a few things we'd like to talk about, and pretty soon people started wanting this presentation, and here we are.
I think that there's another really important part to this. Esther and I have been friends probably for 30 or more years now, and it has always been that there's been this great little sort of edgy humorous aspect,
and that definitely comes through with the gig when you do gigs. So,
and years ago, when I was working on my book called Skookum, I had a part in the book that was called two-way seeing, and it was this idea of the young Kalakamama people and a young settlers boy named Jesse Applegate, who was a historic figure. And it was interesting to juxtapose things culturally, and I would, because Esther was my friend, I would call her and I'd say, "Well, what do you think of this? I want to take these words and juxtapose them, like kayek, which was the word for cake, or flour, for example, in the Chinook jargon." And we really thought that the Chinook jargon, which we could talk more about some point, but was a great example of this kind of amalgam or blending of cultural perspectives embodied in language. And we thought that'd be a lot of fun to play with. And also we like to argue.
Always.
And that always makes good TV.
Well, it does.
Sure.
It makes good. I mean, we do it affectionately, but we certainly have different viewpoints. So it's kind of a neat to just come out and say, okay, this is going to be about two ways of looking at something, and sometimes actually more than two ways.
But it's really, the conversations have really made us more aware of our backgrounds, to investigate some of these things, the reasons why things have happened, and what could possibly be someone's motivation for acting a certain way.
Yeah.
But kind of always digging at each other just a little bit about something about the culture that we don't understand. For example, when we first started this, and Shannon brought out this red blouse, I said, "Red blouse? Don't pioneers always dress in black?" and that was my perception.
Stereotyping.
Exactly. Yeah. You note all the old photographs.
Right.
And all of the pioneer women's clothing looked so black and so severe, And then she told me about the wonderful way that the pioneer women used different plant dyes for their clothing, and it opened my mind about that.
And in fact, I brought a quilt with me today that is called the Applegate Wedding Quilt, and it has scraps of dresses that are very bright colored, scarlets and greens and blues, because it's, you know, it's one thing to sort of tell one another things, but it's great when we have something that we can, that embodies it, you know, like a quilt, where it's obvious to everyone suddenly that, yeah, there really are a lot of patterns and colors in this, you know.
Yeah.
So we always have props that are very important.
Yeah.
So, why don't you show us something?
Sure.
For example.
Well, let's see. How do we do? We should have just been a little more prepared and brought up, where's Cortex?
Cortex.
Ah, right.
I mean,
Cortex.
Cortex is a kind of a...
Yeah.
But,
Well, you can't move because you're tethered, but
I
we can
know.
have them bring it in.
where is Cortex?
In the room where we changed,
Ah.
in the canvas bag.
Okay. So tell that story.
Well,
Well, the
Lilu and Company.
The story of Cortex is one of the many creation stories among the Kalapuya people. Of course, Kalapuya people are Willamette Valley people with 12 groups, 3 dialects. And one of the stories from my family is a story of how the world was made of stone. And there were stone valleys and stone mountains, and at the top of the tallest stone mountain, a life began, and that life became known as Lilu, First Woman. And she walked down from the stone mountain, and she had 2 babies clutched to her breast. And whenever she would step, the grass began to grow. And when she touched the ground, the rivers began to flow. And when she came to the very bottom of that valley, Cortex Mother Wolf was there. And Mother Wolf said, "Where did the babies come from?" Lilu said, "I dreamed of them and they came to me. But I need someone to watch out for them while I go out in the world to look around." And Cortex Mother Wolf said, "I will watch them." And although Lilu was a bit afraid, she made a basket and strapped it to the back of Mother Wolf and put the babies in those baskets. And just to make sure that the babies did not fall out, she wove a wide strap and strapped the babies around the head in the basket. And she went out to look around in the world. And when she came back, the babies were safe. And when she unstrapped them from the basket, she noticed that something was different. Their heads were flattened, the forehead. And she said, "This is good, that the foreheads are flattened. From now on, we will always flatten the foreheads of babies in honor of Cortex Mother Wolf." And that's how that practice came to be, of flattening the foreheads.
And if we were doing the presentation at this point, we would hold up an actual wolf pelt, quite a remarkable wolf, 75 years old or so. Years ago it was shot. And of course there are no wolves, or weren't until the last few years in Oregon. And so it's fascinating to think that wolves are being, that the mother of the people is being reintroduced here. And in a situation like that, to sort of take the other part of the story, I would describe how my great-great-grandmother actually made yarn from the hair of the wolf, because in the 1840s, when settlers first came, one of the first things they agreed to do was to shoot predators. There were 300 European Americans living here when the Applegates arrived with about 900 other people in 1843. But before the Applegates had arrived, already these 300 European Americans were arguing about the fact that the predators, especially the wolves and the coyotes and the cougars, were preying on livestock and so on, that's quite an exaggeration since there weren't many livestock at the time.
But to begin with, right?
Yeah, but they could hardly wait
Yeah.
to shoot those wolves. And so we point out things like 6 pelts of a wolf that would extend from where Esther is sitting out as far as my hand.
Right.
That would require 6 of those to get enough yarn to make a sweater for, a pair of slippers for a child. And my great-great-grandfather had a sleeveless, warmer, it was called, sweater made out of wolf hair. And so this is hardly the sacred, feeling the Kalapuya people had, to this utilitarian, fear-filled, and of course, all of the stories in European American legends,
Peter and the Wolf.
Peter and
Little
the Wolf.
Red Riding Hood.
Little Red Riding
Right,
Hood,
Yeah. And the pioneers really were freaked out because of these stories where the wolf is always the bad guy.
Yeah.
And to our people, wolves were sacred.
Yeah.
They weren't killed for any reason. Only certain people could possess the skins of a wolf. And
Why? Rhetorical question, of course. But.
the people who could possess the skins of the wolf were usually those people who were really very, very honored. They could be perhaps the wise people of the tribe, the medicine people. The wolf skin, actually, if they possessed it, would give them certain powers. And so the skins were got perhaps by maybe a wolf who died of a disease or in a fight or old age.
In Applegate family records, there is a young man who is really sort of an amateur ethnographer who talks about, he had a very close relationship with many of the native people who are Esther's relatives. And he says that when someone died, the people in Splakta'ala, the village, often would hear a wolf. And when they heard the wolf, they felt, according to him, that the wolf embodied, in a sort of real spiritual sense, the person who had just passed over. So it really was something very skookum.
Many of the groups of Kalapuya believe that the wolf is a carrier of the spirit.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine what sort of conflict this was, that we protected the wolves and the pioneers.
And the wolves protected you,
yes,
too.
Yeah. And when the wolves were being turned in for bounty, I was reading an account where one man at one of the trading posts who bought these wolf skins, he said that today the wolf pelts piled up as high as a man's shoulder, and they stank, and we pushed them in the river.
Yeah. It was carnage.
Yeah. Right.
Out of fear.
Right. And of course, that would have an effect on the ecology of the land, very similar to, one of the things that you talked about, maybe you want to talk about that in character in the dialogue, is basically the field burning.
Oh,
And
yes.
and when you stop the field burning, when the pioneers stopped the field burning, the locust plague came by.
Grasshoppers.
Grasshoppers,
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, grasshopper.
Well, for thousands and thousands of years, Kalapuya people, as well as many Western Oregon Indian people, systematically burned the valley. And this was done not in a giant raging forest fire, like the early botanists and the early settlers thought that the valley was ablaze and it was out of control. Each Kalapuya family had a responsibility for a certain portion of the valley. Usually these portions were burned at approximately the same time, and so it did look like a big blaze. But these portions were maintained. They weren't allowed to get out of control. And the burning had many good results. One of them being the fact that the ash was very beneficial for the camas.
Prop,
Yes.
one we have up here.
Yes. Yeah, this is the...
Blooming currently
Yes.
at a field near you.
Yes, all over. And so our people knew that the ash was beneficial to have the camas bloom and to produce and to become very, very large. A part of that also was to toast the seeds of the wild sunflower. Salawa, we call
Salawa,
it.
yeah.
And not only was it used for food, but the oil was extracted from it and used in ceremonies. But the one that I really like, and when we do this for school kids, we talk about the grasshoppers, and that the grasshoppers were a food of the Kalapuya people. And the kids, I think, have in their mind that the fires would burn and we would go along and pick up individual grasshoppers here and there. but we had a wonderful
Smarter
method.
than that.
Wonderful method. We would dig trenches, and as the fires advanced, the grasshoppers would look for a safe haven. And in their little insect minds, I suppose, they saw this trench and, oh, that's safety. But when the fire went over them, it toasted them. And so the people would go and scoop up grasshoppers. And they were used for food, but not chocolate covered.
Not chocolate.
No.
Right. And they don't taste like chicken.
No.
Or shrimp.
The interesting thing, and you know, we really work very hard to have good documentation for everything that we do, and the documentation on the settler side. There are several letters from a man in our family named J.W. Parrott Huntington, and he describes very clearly, as he writes to relatives in Connecticut, that the grasshoppers for 2 years in a row have managed to devour all of the seedling apple trees, all of the crops that were planted. And it is interesting to realize that it is 1857 when he writes and says that didn't happen this year, right? And who knows why, but it's very close to the time that people were removed. The problems started when the Indian people were removed, as it was said,
right.
And so we're no longer burning or in their way tending or managing the land, so that the population of grasshoppers essentially got out of control, and then through some natural cycle kind of apparently smoothed out again, because you don't hear anything about it after that period of time.
So, in terms of, there was a story that was part of your presentation in terms of talking about, in terms of the removal, how Kamafima was not removed and your family interceded. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How did that work?
I think that a little bit of a preface here, maybe.
Yeah.
And that is, it was 1846 when a group of settlers came down looking for a trail, which they were calling the South Road, a way to get into Oregon, essentially that avoided the old Oregon Trail route, which went along the Columbia River.
Right.
That trail has subsequently been called the Applegate Trail, although Our family didn't ever name it that. They just simply called it the South Road. But in 1846, when Jesse Applegate and Lindsay Applegate and about 13 other men came through, and they came to the Yoncalla area, they saw a sign that there were Native people there. They saw a rabbit snare in a tree. They saw some other things that made them know that there were people, but there was no sign of anyone. No one came forward. About 3 years later, in 1849, when the Applegate brothers felt that it was just such a lovely country they'd passed through, and they were very intrigued by the fact of the native annual grasses that were growing, which they said were as high as the sides of their horses, and smelled like some wonderful spice, like a grandmammy spice chest that was opened up. And Jesse Applegate's horse caught a whiff of this grass. Old Jim was his name. And he ran, and basically it was this old horse that picked the spot where the Applegates eventually settled. But on that trip came an emissary from Esther's great-great-grandfather, and he was called Kamafima, and the settlers gave him the name of Halo, which was a Chinook jargon name. But when they arrived, and then the emissary went to find the headman, Esther's great-great-grandfather, he came and they spoke in the Chinook jargon to one another, and the Applegate brothers asked if they could have permission to come and bring their moose, the not too imaginative word for cattle in the Chinook jargon. Moose. Yeah. And their kluchman, which meant their wives, and the kloshtilicum, the people close to them, and live there. And, you know, Kamafima thought about this. He was an extremely dignified person. And finally he said that, yes, they could do that because he thought they were skookum, highest skookum. And so...
What does that mean?
Well, skookum is an interesting word that means spirit and spirit power.
Good in the heart.
Good in the heart. That there was something that was courteous and respectful about asking if one could come. Not just sort of rolling, you know, roll 'em. I mean, it wasn't
Keep
like
those
that.
wagons rolling. Yeah.
And so I think there was a tie that was established at that time. And so for a decade, these families knew one another, lived next to one another. Their children played together. There were, of course, difficulties once the illnesses came. But even so, the personal relationships were still strong.
Yeah.
So that sort of gets us to why, when the soldiers appeared to round up all Native people in that part of Oregon, and were collecting members of tribes along the way, when they got to Yoncalla and went looking for the headman of the Komema, and then were directed by some settler, I don't know which one, to where he lived. And when Kamafima said, I will not go, you know, I will not go. I have been here since this white oak tree has been here, this huge, wonderful oak tree. And so the soldiers got very angry, and someone got wind, one of the Applegate kids, the sons, got wind of it and went after Jesse, Lindsay, Charlie, and members of the Wilson family. And they rode over from their ranches, and they told the subagent, Robert Metcalf, they said, he's right. He's not going, and you're not taking him. And that was the way it was. And again, this is a document where he complains bitterly about settlers interfering. But Esther always makes a good point about this, because it should be made about settlers and coming to the aid sometimes of Indian people. I was thinking about the stories you've told about the people around Coos Bay.
I mean, and that's part of the point of two-way seeing, is basically showing that there is a basis for mutual respect, and there was mutual respect. It wasn't, you know, the cowboy Indian narrative of genocide and massacre and all that kind of stuff.
And it also wasn't lo the poor Indian. It wasn't that type of an attitude. It was person on person, friendship of people really and honestly liking each other.
Well, and family ties. In Coos Bay, I was thinking about when they started rounding up people again during the Civil War, and Royal Benzel writes in his diaries that there were unions, marriages, offspring, I mean, intimate ties, familial ties, so that there were many men who were settlers who refused to permit the soldiers to take their children or their wives when they could do that effectively.
So our people from my family remained in the Oncala area the rest of their lives, or until they had to move away for one reason or the other. I'm enrolled with the Siletz Nation because one of my ancestors wound up at Siletz for one reason or the other and fell in love with a young man and settled there.
Are you referring to Celista?
No.
Okay.
No. I'm referring to actually Celista's, it would be her daughter.
I guess I should say at this point, my wife and I, Sherry, have a local history project, I2M Eugene, which we tend to be activist historians, so making things visible, talking stones being one of those things.
Oh,
and, you know, talking about, you know, Moses Harris, Black Harris, and Wiley Griffin, et cetera, And at one point, in terms of the discussions around what was because our kids had both gone to what was Patterson Elementary School, and when they were renaming that, and the discussions of what are we going to rename that, and so I kind of stood up and said, look, okay, this is like Kalapuya land. I suggest we name it like Celista now. And now there is a convention within Native culture generically. We don't necessarily honor one particular person. Okay, we honor a people, right? So, you know, the way it was going was, okay, I could understand we're not going to break that convention at this point. So either name it for a group of folks, or so that's why the bike path gets named Sanchivan, or that was with the talking stones around that particular point. So eventually it became Chavez, right? But and the reason I wanted to do that is basically to talk about, because, you know, Caesar did come here, but, you know, before that, and we did have a Kalapuya high school, okay, all right, so that I think Celista's story bears mentioning because of, you know, the kind of heroic nature of it. Can you?
Certainly. My great-grandfather was Kamafima, the one who met the Applegates. And he had 3 sons. And one of those sons, his name was Biel. And at this point in time, we're not exactly sure what the date was, but it was 150 years ago plus. And Biel, my great-grandfather, was a horseman. And most people don't think of Oregon Indians being horsemen. They think of the Indians of the plains shooting the buffalo. But horse racing was fairly big business in Oregon. Remains of horse tracks all up and down the Willamette Valley, big arenas where anytime pioneers got together, anytime Indians got together, there was horse racing. And my great-grandfather Biel was the fastest horseman in the territory at the time. And he was only 16. But his father thought it was time that he was married. And of course, at 16, he didn't want anything to do with that. But he respected his father, and he took his little horse up to the Columbia River, to the villages of the Multnomah people, who reportedly had the most beautiful women on the river. And when he got there, it was early spring, and a lot of trading and a lot of celebrations going on, and lots of horse racing. And so he spent the entire time that he was there racing his horse, Little Mawicha, she was called, and he won every race.
Little deer.
Little deer. And he completely forgot about why he was there. He was supposed to find a wife. Well, as he was walking through one of the villages, he saw a young girl, the most beautiful young girl he'd ever seen. And she was 13, which was very marriageable age, and her name was Celista. But there was a problem, because she was promised to someone else. And another man had given her father 30 horses as the bride price, and he'd accepted, and so it was a deal. Well, they didn't know what to do. My great-grandfather Biel and Celista were so in love with each other, they even told Celista's father that they would run away, which was unheard of in those days. So Celista's father, perhaps being a bit of a businessman, said, if you bring me 50 horses next spring, then you can have Celista, and I'll take care of the other man. So Biel went back down to Yoncalla and worked all that summer, all that winter, worked for the Applegate family, for other families, for a good wage, trying to get enough money to buy 50 horses. But when spring came, he had 20 or less. So, not knowing what else to do, he took these horses, he took his little Mawicha, went up to Celista's village, and said to her father, this is all I have. And her father had already given back the horses to this other man. And so again, he saw a way to make a profit by saying, let's have a race. We have a fast horse, faster than your Mawicha. If you win, you can have Celista. But if you lose, then you leave your horses and you leave Celista and you never come back. And Biel agreed. Of course he'd do it. He was the fastest horseman in the territory.
For your love, right?
Yes. And they set up the race, and little Mawicha lost. She went lame. And they found out later that the man who first wanted to marry Celista was so jealous that he had driven a stone into Mawicha's hoof.
Oh.
But they didn't know it. So Biel kept his part of the agreement. He left his horses, and he left Celista, and he went back down to Yoncalla. He was heartbroken. He said he'd never, ever marry. And that winter was one of the hardest winters on record. More snow in those valleys than they'd seen in their life. And Biel was out hunting one day, and he heard a noise behind some trees, and when he went to look, there was Celista. And she had walked 150 miles.
In the hardest winter.
In the dead of winter. And it was a horrible thing because she was almost dead.
He called her Little Deer. Yes, Mawicha. Yeah.
Took her to the village of Splachtalla. They used all of their medicines, and even Melinda Applegate, who was an herbalist, came over with all of her medicines. And the story is that the Applegates hid her in a closet in the old house that still stands today because her father came looking for her. And it took a long time, but she did recover. And she and Biel were married. They had 9 children. 3 lived to be adults because of the diseases. And I like to tell people that this is a really true love story, but the best part of it is that my 13-year-old granddaughter, who wants to be a storyteller.
Wait, she's 13 now?
She's 13.
Yes.
That baby that when Sherry and I
Yeah.
interviewed you at the
Yeah.
that baby is 13
That
now?
baby is 13.
Baby is 13.
Her name is Celista.
Time
and that,
does fly.
That is a wonderful family story that really, it ties history together, it ties the families together, and kind of gives us hope that these stories in one form or the other exist all over, that people can take hope that there are friendships at last.
So what do you do when you've done your presentations? Has that ever been controversial?
I think that maybe at some of the presentations people were a little disappointed that we didn't talk more about not liking each other.
You think so?
I think so. I think they might have been looking for just paying lip service to being friends, other than it being the real thing.
Well, I think we really try to not be euphemistic about things.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
because there certainly were times when there were remarkable stresses on the relationship, even between our families, and I don't think that either of us, I mean, I think we both are pretty clear-eyed about what we could call the American narrative, the Western
Right,
narrative,
right,
the
right,
Oregon narrative,
right,
for that
yeah,
matter.
Right.
But I also think, there is a kind of a stereotypical response about what the Western narrative is. In another part of my own experience, I was the editor for a volume of Oregon Letters and Diaries, and I traveled around collecting them. And I was interested in the narratives of women and children, particularly, but also of what the historian Patricia Limerick calls the counter-narrative, this sort of subtext, and there
Yeah.
is one.
Yeah,
there is
there is
one.
one, right.
However, this is a subtext too.
Yeah.
This is a subtext that there were these pockets, not just here in Oregon, but clear back into the colonial times in New England, the Winslow family and the native people around Massachusetts, for example, that there has always been this sort of strand of a special relationship that was positive between native people and settlers.
It was especially strong, the ties between the women,
Yes.
simply because
The women are smarter, but
there was so much to share.
And so much to do.
Yeah, getting the food, keeping the family clothed, tending to the babies,
Yeah.
keeping the men in line. All of these things were things that we shared with each other. It wasn't just that the Indian people taught a lot of stuff to the pioneers, but we learned a lot of things at the same time.
yeah.
One of the stories we used to tell was an Oregon Trail story about a man and his wife, a true story, were lowering their wagon somewhere around Mount Emily in Pendleton area there. And the mother had taken the baby and put the baby against the tree in blankets and so forth, while she assisted her husband in this very difficult endeavor of lowering the wagons and sort of being his eyes and ears as this feat was undertaken. When she turned around, she was just stunned to see these three strapping Indian men standing by the baby. And she was terrified. All these, dreadful narratives
Right.
about kidnappings and the savages,
yeah.
doing all this. And so the story goes that she she saw one of the men pick up the baby, and she thought, that, all of this is, and so she went to them and so on. One turned out to be actually a native person who spoke, who had little mission English, and he unbraided her for leaving her baby there untended. And essentially, these Indian men were protecting this child and were just astonished that this woman would leave it there. And of course, it gave her the baby back, and were quite indignant that that settlers didn't treat their children better.
When we talk about, for example, the Chinook jargon, so would it be correct in saying that Chinook is to Oregon what, for example, Latin was to the Roman Empire or Swahili was to Africa, a trade language? I mean, people had their own tribal language, but there's a common language that you use in trading between
the
folks.
lingua franca.
Lingua franca, right.
Yeah. Yes, you could certainly say that it was the lingua franca. But the interesting thing about it is, in the United States, there was only one other trade language that was so distinctive, and it was in the Southeast. And it was, of course, came into sort of obsolescence in the early 1800s, very early 1800s. And what's fascinating about Chinook jargon here on the opposite coast, which is this amalgam of some French words, English words, Chinook, tribal words, and what am I missing? Something Scottish, something else.
Yeah, more of everything.
Kind of a potpourri of words. What's astonishing is that there's such vitality that Chinook, even in my grandfather's time, settlers knew how to speak Chinook. My grandfather knew how to speak Chinook. And so it is viable and today. And then who did you tell me was using that as what tribe was working with?
Well, many of the tribes are now teaching it on the reservations.
Right. Well, we're teaching it here at Lane.
Yeah, at Lane.
Right. Chinookwawa.
Yeah.
Great.
You can get it for college credit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really? I
Yes.
didn't know that. That's terrific.
Yes, it's being televised remote.
That's
Not even as we speak, but we do it from here, from the studio. So.
But it was spoken by everyone, and everyone understood.
Nika Nisaika Kladawa Nanaj. The settlers and my grandfather and great uncles used to, when they were taking a child, to tuck the child in bed. It meant, come and go with me in the night. Come go to sleep. Yeah.
So, as educators, what do you want people to be able? How does this play in the 21st century?
Whoa.
Well, I would think that in this day and age, still, people are completely fascinated with cowboys and Indians. And we've been chased across the movie screen for so many years. And I find, amazingly enough, that there are still people who believe we're like Hollywood says we are.
Yeah.
It is just amazing because of the questions I get from kids in school. Just really odd questions, like from fourth graders. Do you still live in a teepee? How did you get here? Did you ride a horse? And in my perception would be, don't these kids learn something in the school? Is that
Yes
not
and no.
taught?
Yes and no. I mean, that's one of the pieces that when you do something like this, if we can't get, it isn't all ancient history. I mean, this has meaning for today, which is part of what the question is about, really.
Yeah.
What are we repeating that we didn't learn last time, with the newcomers now, and
Right.
what wealth are we not carrying forward into the future?
And, I think there is even a sort of pertinent international look one might take of something like the kind of program we're doing. When you think of this whole notion of reconciliation,
Yes.
that of reconciliation that can only take place if honesty is practiced, and if there is a frank and open dialogue between the persons and cultures and peoples and tribes and groups who are trying to reconcile, that this kind of a conversation that really puts it all out there, and which in a sort of public way says, these were wrongs, we recognize and remember them, and how are we going to go ahead? And we try to model that very consciously,
And being honest, I think, is the most important thing. Being honest about your history. Part of the thing that I see in people learning about the true American history is that a lot of it has been omitted, especially on the part of Indians. A lot of it's been glossed over. And I think the only way that we can learn lessons that we can use is to be honest with each other, to know that some horrible things happened, but yet some good things happened. And enough to give us the information that we are not going to allow that to happen again to anybody.
And that we can still go forward.
Yes.
I mean, part of what, when in Eugene, when we were doing, the history, so just to make that visible, there was a forum on racism, so they were taking the United Nations approach, except they weren't going to have any natives. So Sherry and I asked, okay, so do you know Esther? Because this is Kalapuya land, why ain't you got no natives? Right? And so a chance, one, if we hadn't known you, then no natives would have been represented. And then when you got on the panel, you made that comment about, okay, well, there's nothing here that recognizes that we're here, and that one thing led to another, and then the talking stones.
Right.
Okay, so just, talking about the talking stones, where, all right, how many words make up a language? And so if 141 words exist from Yankala Kalapuya, and we put 11 of them on rocks, okay, which as soon as they were installed, they got defaced by, shall we say, Christian graffiti, right? Because the symbolism there was clear. All right, well, what's up with that? What do you feel threatened about that? Why did you feel the need to do that? And so to talk about that, and so then what happens when we bring the language back? What does it take to bring those words? So skookum, right, of good heart, right? The Chinook Wawa, which is not only Chinook, but French and Scottish and a bunch of other, it's a collaboration. That's here, that's indigenous, that's basically talking about how do we bring this, our mutual cultures, into the future to work together. Because sooner or later, if that grows, then it's going to be Russian and Vietnamese and Thai and whatever else, and Spanish and, Nahuatl and whatever else, Yoruba, however that works.
And the key to the whole thing is conversation with honesty. And that to me is the most important thing.
One of the things you talk about, your sort of activism, the need to have something really embody the notion, the ideal. And one of the things that has come out of Esther's and my work is that we have a camp in Yankala every summer. This will be the 7th year, I think.
And don't forget to talk about your gig, too.
It's called Camp Two-Way Singing.
Okay.
And so Esther and her daughters, and Susan, my cousin, Susan Applegate, and I, and sometimes my daughters, we share respective traditions from the Kalapuya people and from settlers. And so these children, most of whom are scholarship kids, come to this camp every year. And this is our way to make this a reality in our community.
So we got the 2-minute signal.
Yeah.
So your gig at the Axe and Fiddle.
Oh,
you.
the gig.
Yes,
We
thank
need
you.
to remove our hats.
So we have to take off our Indian and
No,
But
just give us the date.
It's the 30th of
May 30th.
May 30th, 8 o'clock at the Axe and Fiddle. And no, we will not be talking about pioneer Indian things particularly. We sing in a cowgirl band.
Okay.
the slow ponies.
Slow ponies. Okay.
Yes.
So if you like what you've seen tonight, email us feedback at liveclass@lanecc.edu. Put DiversiTV in the subject line. I want to thank Shannon and Esther for coming in and sharing two-way seeing. Get in contact with them. They have a website, which is...
ApplegateHouse.com.
All right. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
This has been DiversiTV. Go well, stay well. Be of good heart.